Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Cyclical Investors Club YouTube channel. Usually I do individual stock analysis on this channel, but I'm going to have a new series that I publish over time about some of the lessons I've learned from Charlie Munger. He recently passed away just shy of 100 years old, and he had a very big impact on my life in general, and also obviously an impact on investing. And I mean, my bigger picture always goes beyond investing. I try to limit myself a lot of the time to sticking with investing. But I mean, what's the point of investing if it doesn't, have a positive impact on people's lives and just civilization in general, which I think is something Charlie would agree with. And so there's no way that I could put into a single video or even a couple videos all the different interesting and worthy topics that Charlie Munger has talked about, written about over the years. So I'm going to maybe make a playlist out of this and just start with one of the ones I think is maybe the most important and broadly applicable. But I'm definitely going to take kind of a personal approach here. I know there are plenty of Charlie Munger experts, and I'm sure they'll have their videos and interviews and so forth. I've watched some of them. I wanted to get a feeling for what other people were saying, just to see if I would offer anything new and different and have a slightly different perspective. And I definitely think I do after watching some of them, which is understandable. A lot of things can be a little more superficial, or you're not going to normally dig deep into the weeds when you're broadcasting things on like broadcast television and stuff like that. So the topic for today, and the first one that I think probably in general had the biggest impact on me, is the idea of using multiple mental models to understand the world better than you can if you just have one or two kind of operating models in your head from like one particular perspective or another particular perspective. I just listened to or watched Charlie's last interview with Becky Quick, and one of the things that jumped out at me was how he said he realized early on the benefit of taking this multidisciplinary approach to everything. And he said, he knew he was probably in like the 1% of, intelligence or something along those lines, but that he wasn't really like a prodigy in any particular area. And I definitely relate to that. I would say, whenever you study like a super investor or somebody who's really accomplished in any given field, and you try to, before you kind of copy them or emulate them, it's always good to look at the differences between your situation and their situation. And Charlie definitely came from a more privileged background than I did. My parents were teenagers when I was born, and then divorced a few years later, and I have 5 younger brothers and sisters. So I definitely came from a very poor family relative to Charlie's, who had a pretty successful family from the beginning. So when you come from a background where you don't have some of the same early opportunities that Charlie definitely had, you have to take that into account too. So, I mean, I would say in practical terms, while, maybe I am like the top 1% in some sort of intelligence or whatever, I would say growing up, like top 10% in practical terms was probably really where I was, because I just didn't have the same kind of resources that a lot of other people that maybe similar intelligence that I had. So my performance probably wouldn't have been in the top 1%. Usually it depended. I moved around a lot. I went to 9 different schools. So probably in some schools I was in the top 1, and in the other schools I might have been in the top 10. I was usually somewhere, I think, in the top 10, no matter where I went. But, generally I was never the top of the class. I was usually number 2 or something like that in any given subject that I was any good at. So The way this relates to Charlie is what he was saying is the benefits that he had from broadening his knowledge to multiple disciplines was tremendous. So he was able to, and this is my interpretation of what he's saying, but I think you probably agree. He was able to ultimately perform much better than just 1% because he was able to integrate all these different models together and understandings and knowledge and everything by broadening out. And that's basically what I ended up doing as well. And then I also chose things eventually once I got a little smarter and had a little bit more practical wisdom, where you realize that you go into fields where there aren't like prodigies, so where it takes a long time and where this accumulated wisdom really adds up at the end. So I taught myself how to write, like enough to be a professional writer, even though I didn't study writing in school. And the good part about that is there aren't very many. One, it takes a long time usually to do well. A lot of the people who are naturally gifted at it probably go into different fields, and there aren't any like young writing prodigies, right? So nobody's starting super young, and I definitely started late. I didn't go to college, like a university, until I was 21, and then I didn't go back to graduate school until I was in my 30s. So that I definitely had a late start in pretty much everything. So being able to branch out after I read, I didn't read Charlie's work until it was between the time I got my bachelor's degree and the time I went to graduate school. And I read Poor Charlie's Almanac, which I have pulled up here on Wikipedia. And it really, really struck me as genius. I still read it every year, at least parts of it. And I'm probably going to reread it again as I make these videos. But as soon as I read the book, I branched out and I read a lot of different works. Like most of the great works. I think Charlie has a list of books that he thought were important too. I read pretty much all those. And I had already read pretty broadly. I started off as in engineering in school, and since I was working a full-time job, I just couldn't keep up with the workload, and I switched to political science, and then I had minors in history and philosophy, so I was probably just shy of like a triple major by the time I graduated, and I found all those things all interconnected, and then after I graduated, I basically taught myself, like a master's degree in writing over the course of about 4 years. And then I had like science experiments I would like do in the garage and stuff. So I've always kind of been interested, whatever piques my curiosity, I get into and try to learn it. So it was pretty easy for me to read just pretty broadly and understand the importance of how these things and start putting them together. So by the time I went to graduate school, I kind of have developed my own mental models and my own lattice work, and I had my own theory that I was working on, like my own political theory and sort of broader theory of life. And I remember I turned in a paper or something, and where I was basically explaining my theory, and one of my professors was like, "Well, you can't write your own theory. Like, you're not allowed to do that," basically. And it really made me think of Charlie. It's like, okay, really a lot of people in academia, they're researching stuff that like they're researchers, so they'll go and research what other people said, and and in the humanities, it's like, well, you study Plato or whatever, or Aristotle or something, and your job is just to research them and argue about what they said, and it's like, well, don't you have anything like of yourself that you've learned in the past 3,000 years that maybe you could add a little bit to this? And it's like, well, if you become a PhD and you want to write your own book someday, maybe you can do that, but you're not allowed to just come in and just explain your theory and see what people think about it. And so I really, and this is one of the things Charlie really railed on. So to tie it back, I'm going to read just a couple paragraphs from Poor Charlie's Almanac on this kind of the barriers that businesses and bureaucracies and academia put up. And so he says, Of course, when I urge a multidisciplinary approach, that you've got to have the main models from a broad array of disciplines and you've got to use them all, I'm really asking you to ignore jurisdictional boundaries. And the world isn't organized that way. It discourages the jumping of jurisdictional boundaries. Big bureaucratic businesses discourage it, and of course, academia itself discourages it. All I can say there is that in that respect, academia is horribly wrong and dysfunctional. And some of the worst dysfunctions in business come from the fact that they balkanize reality into little individual departments with territorial and turf protection and so forth. So, if you want to be a good thinker, you must develop a mind that can jump the jurisdictional boundaries. You don't have to know it all, just take the best big ideas from all these disciplines, and it's not that hard to do. So that's really a rallying cry, I think, for what I think kind of sets Charlie apart from nearly everybody. There are some movements now, I think, that are like the heterodoxy folks that are trying to do more of this, which is great. But Charlie was maybe the first, or the most well-known first. And so basically what I was very fortunate to tie this back to my own kind of mini story that I stumbled upon Edmund Burke. And when I read his works, first I noticed he was almost always right. And people rarely listen to him. So it was like he kind of gets ignored, but then he gets proven correct over time on almost everything. And then what I also noticed is that underneath what he was doing, it looked like he was basically kind of using kind of the theory that I was kind of working on. And so what I was able to do is, for my master's thesis, I was able to go and tie my theory to Edmund Burke, and pitch it as his theory, and that ended up working out really well. I had to learn everything I could about. I didn't know anything about English history really, or British history, and I didn't know anything, especially about that era, very much. And so in 1 year, I had to kind of learn all that and then put it together for my master's thesis. But the same year that I wrote that, this book here came out. I didn't read it beforehand, but it's by Jesse Norman. I think it was an MP in Parliament. And when I read it, he basically described Burke in the same way that I interpreted him as well. And so that made me feel pretty good, since I'm not even from the same country. And I was kind of getting in the middle of some serious debates, about how to interpret Burke. But so that made me feel good. I was like, okay, so at least I'm not completely, wrong in these regards. So there, especially when there's cultural differences, the time differences. We're talking like the 1700s and things like that. But using all these multidisciplinary things, I mean, just look at what I do now. I teach people basically how to invest in the stock market and share how to develop strategies and theories on how to invest. Well, I didn't go to school for finance or business or economics. I mean, you have to understand these things in order to understand all the rest of the stuff, which I think is what Charlie is getting at. If you understand the big ideas, you don't have to be like super duper smart. You just have to continue learning. And he does have a point in the same section of that I was reading from here where he's like, if Warren Buffett stopped learning after he had left like Columbia Business School, he wouldn't have had nearly the success that he's had now. So it's really all about how you can continue learning and pulling these things together, and then kind of thinking for yourself and developing your own models to judge things by. And if you can do that, I mean, you can basically take, in terms of like practical wisdom and intelligence, you can go from like the top 10% to the top 0.2% or something like that. Because people get locked into and our whole society encourages it. Specialization is rewarded. And if you look at I was just reading some comments on an article about paying for higher education, and everybody's mind is all about how much money your degree can make you. And for someone like me, I'm like, well, really, it's more important to learn how to learn and then keep doing it when you get done. If you're really focused on the money. There's plenty of people with more raw intelligence than I have who make really bad mistakes, even investing, but in life too. Where I think if they would have maybe even just read more literature, they would be better for it. I look at some of these tech CEOs and stuff, and what they're doing, and it's like, well, they're making really silly errors that if they had a good high school history or literature class, they would not be probably making. So, but it doesn't mean they're not super smart and geniuses. They could be, but they're not actively sort of taking advantage of that raw brain power that they have. So yeah, definitely read Poor Charlie's Almanac, which is what I have pulled up here on the Wikipedia page. I have the third edition, and I'm going to talk more about this. But using multiple mental models, even this year I ran across an anthropologist and a French anthropologist, and it was so, I don't have too many things nowadays that I come across that I'm really sort of really feel like I need to read and understand right away. But I came across his work, and I got really into it because it was just such a unique view, and it looked like they had a pretty good grasp on looking at society and things from an angle. It was about family structure, and how that's primary to government structures and things like that. And that has effects for investing, for sure. And even just knowing that that theory is out there is important. So if you join like the Cyclical Investors Club, every now and then, once a year or twice a year, I'll write a whole week's thing on what I happen to be reading, and I know people read it and they're like, what is Kramer going on about family structure and everything? But it's part of the mental model, multi-mental model approach. And I do think it's important, or it could be important, especially if combined with these other things sometimes. So, all right, that's the end of this first lecture, and or explanation, talk, whatever you want to call it. And there's a lot more Charlie lessons, I think, that I've noticed over the years, and I'll make some more videos about those. If you like this, subscribe. If you just like individual stock analysis, subscribe too. That's usually what I do. And I'll see everybody later.